Let's return to Luke chapter 22 today as we continue our study through the Gospel of Luke. We'll continue again spending some time at the table with Jesus and his disciples in what's often called the Last Supper. It's the Last Supper before his death. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at how this was an observance of the Passover and the comparisons between that and his own death as our Passover lamb, and how he changed that memorial of that event in Egypt to be a memorial going forward of his own death, as we just thought about in observance of that. And then last week, we looked at how his blood represents a new covenant for us as well. At the conclusion of that, talking about all that, he also revealed to them that there was a traitor in their midst. In verse 21, he says, "But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." Maybe 3 weeks ago, we had a lesson on Judas, and of course, we know that's who it is, but the disciples didn't know who he was talking about. And this sparks an interesting discussion that goes from a nice picture of humility to, unfortunately, takes an ugly turn and turns into a display of pride. And Jesus has an interesting response to all that. So that's what we'll be looking at in our text today. Verse 23 says, "They began to question one another which one of them it could be who was going to do this." That's, of course, the only natural response. If Jesus says, there's only 13 of them there sitting at the table, and if he says, one of you, my betrayer, is here at the table with us, of course, the only thing anybody would be thinking about for a while would be, who is it? Now, you might imagine that if they began to discuss or wonder like who it could be, if this was basically turned into a finger-pointing exercise. But actually, if we look at Matthew's account, we see that it was not. In Matthew 26, I'm really rather impressed with the way that they responded to that. Let's go over to Matthew's account. He includes this little detail that kind of changes the picture a little bit. Matthew 26, verse 22, "And they were very sorrowful when he told them that, and they began to say to him one after another, 'Is it I, Lord?'" That's Matthew 26, 22. That's a beautiful picture of humility. That Jesus said to them, the one who is going to betray me is at the table. And their thought was not, "Oh, I bet I know who it is. I bet it's..." But instead, their thought was, "Is it me?" And as I thought about that, I think maybe, even though this is right off the bat, one of the more important lessons in this sermon will be that this is a great illustration of how I think we should all respond to Jesus' words. Sometimes, you hear a sermon and you think to yourself, "Oh, I know somebody that needs to hear that." And sometimes people, especially more so when I go to gospel meetings, I hear that people will be like, "Oh, I wish so-and-so had been able to hear that," or "I know somebody that needs to. I need to get a recording because I know somebody that needs that lesson." And that's good. It's good to want to. And sometimes we even say, hopefully we learn something we can take and share with others. And that's nothing wrong with that. But first and foremost, we need to ask, does this apply to me? That starts with me, and it starts with you. But as we read, as we study, our initial response should be, I think, to everything Jesus says, we should ask, "Is it I, Lord? Is it me?" When Jesus issues a rebuke or a warning or an instruction, we should always begin by saying, "Are you talking to me? Is this me? Do I need to hear this? What do I need to take away from that?" Before we think about the people to our right or our left, we should all be just like these men and say, "Is it me?" Of course, in this case, it was not them who was going to betray him. It was only Judas. And verse 23, Jesus answers them, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" He said to him, "You have said so." Now, you would think that would have eliminated any confusion at all about who is the one, because he just basically told him. But it seems clear. Let's go over to John. John adds another little detail to this, John 13. It seems clear that either they didn't hear this conversation between Judas and Jesus, or they didn't understand, because they still don't seem to know exactly what's going on or who it is. In John's account, down in verse 27 of chapter 13, it says, after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him, talking about Judas. Jesus said to him, what you are going to do quickly. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought it was because Judas had the money bag, and Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he immediately went out, and it was night. So there's some sequence of events here that's kind of hard to piece all these together and exactly to know like what was said in what order. But it seems clear that the disciples, whatever it was that Jesus said in this interaction with Judas, it didn't make it obvious to everybody at that moment that Judas was the betrayer. They did not know that, I think, until he showed up at the garden with the mob, with the lanterns and swords. Then it would have been obvious. But at this point, they still didn't understand that Judas was going to be the betrayer. Now, I just said all that I thought that was an interesting, to just see how that all unfolded. But let's go back now to Luke 22. We will come back to John in just a moment. If you're using a paper Bible, you might want to place a marker there, or something to hold your place. But back in Luke, so they were immediately trying to figure out, as you would imagine, okay, who is it going to be? Who is this person who's going to betray him? And then a very strange thing happens. In verse 24, a dispute also arose among them as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Now that's bizarre. One moment, they're all humble enough to say, is it me? Am I the betrayer? Are you talking to me? Like that shows a striking level of humility to me, that they would respond in that way. But then there was some confusion over who is it going to be. And then somehow in the middle of all that, there's an argument that comes out like, who is the greatest? And I don't know how that happened. I don't know, we're not told like how did this conversation play out, that it transitioned. But I think there's something there about human nature as well, that it seems strange that you could at one moment be so humble and the next moment be, having a pride-filled kind of argument. But at the same time, we know that just hours after this, Peter in one moment is going to be drawing his sword, ready to go to battle and die for Jesus. And then hours after that, he's going to be saying to a servant girl that he didn't know who Jesus was. We'll save that story for another lesson, but it just shows me that we can be very inconsistent sometimes. We can have moments of strength. We can have a day when we're doing everything just right and we're making the right choices. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be tempted or tripped up just moments later. So we need to be on guard, because Satan is always looking to trap us and trip us. And sometimes when you're coming off of a good feeling of, hey, I handled that the right way, or you feel good about having done something the right way, that's exactly when there's going to be a trap. There's going to be a temptation. And it's sad that we can be that way, but I think that we see that clearly in several examples, and this is one of them, how, one moment they're humble and the next they're proud. Let's look at Jesus' response, and that's really what we're going to dwell on. Verse 25, he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. So first he begins by describing the way things are in the world in a normal circumstance. And this might have been more prominent. I think it was more prominent in their day than even in our day, where in their day you had these definite classes of people. That's probably more like the way it is in England, in fact. But in America, we don't really think of things quite this way. But I think we can still relate to what he's saying. In their day, you had the kings, you had the people in authority, and they lorded it over everybody else. To lord it over is to domineer, to act arrogantly toward, to basically act toward other people as if you're somehow, the reason why you're here and they're there is you're better than they are. And to just kind of boss them around and domineer them. That was a typical way that someone who is in high authority, that's how they interacted with those people underneath them. On the flip side, he says, and they are called benefactors. So from the point of view of the person under them, they call those people benefactors. And a benefactor, the idea is one who gives grace. And so if you can imagine a very wealthy man in town who kind of owns everything, like a nobleman or somebody who is the ruler, local guy, and it would be up to him to grant favors, and he could give something to somebody, but he would be, high and wealthy, and everybody else is low and poor, and they would just beg of him some favor from him. And so he had it within his power to help them out of a bind or to give them some blessing. And so they saw those people at the top. From the downside looking up, they were like, oh, they're our benefactors. Like they just needed some little thing from them. And it was the place of the guy at the top to perhaps, give some grace, give some help, give some gift to this person, to that person. And they, meanwhile, exercise lordship over. So in their minds, if you got that picture in your mind, that's what it meant to be the boss, the guy at the top, the person on the throne. And if you can think about which would you rather be, the guy who is telling other people what to do, that has people running and jumping and doing exactly what he says, or the person who has to do what the other guy says? Or which one would you rather be? The one who has everything and you can kind of dole it out at your will, or the people who would depend on his kindness and generosity for whatever they have? Of course, everybody in that culture would long to be the guy at the top. That's what you would think, like, oh, imagine what it must be like to be him instead of being me. And in this case, they're kind of arguing about who in the Lord's kingdom, when his kingdom is established, who's going to be at the top of the ladder? Who's going to be the greatest? That's what they were aspiring to. And they were arguing about, it'll be me. No, it'll be me. So that's an interesting argument from, is it I? But they're arguing over who's going to be the one that's going to be at the top. So Jesus says, yeah, this is how it is in the world, but not so, verse 26, with you. This is not going to be the way it's going to be in his kingdom. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. So again, in their world, to understand, the youngest was at the end of the line. And I've even heard people talk about how even in our country, this has kind of changed, that it used to be maybe several generations ago that the adults got their food first and all the way down to the kids. And there may or may not be enough of whatever, all of the fried chicken might be gone by the time the kids went through the line. That's just tough. That's what happens when you're a little kid. You're kind of last, And it seems like somewhere down through the years, we've turned a lot of that around now where it isn't always that way anymore. But it was that if you were the youngest, you were at the end of the line in their culture. And if you had a house of servants, the youngest servant, the newest guy on the block, had to do the lowliest of tasks. So if you can imagine a household, and you can imagine the kinds of things that servants might have to do, whatever would be the grimiest, lowliest, most humble assignment would be given to the juniorest, the lowest person. So that's the youngest. And by the way, one of those tasks would be like washing everybody's feet. So that task would be given to the lowest of the low. But Jesus is saying here that the greatest among you shall become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. Jesus' idea sounds completely upside down, and it is. He's taking their whole concept of what it means to be the greatest, and he's completely inverting it. Because what he's describing as the greatest is what they would have thought of as the lowest. And that's exactly his point. That's exactly what he's saying. And what does it look like in practice? Look what he says in verse 27. For who is the greater, the one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. So Jesus says, obviously, the more important, the higher up you are, you'd be more likely to be the guy sitting there waiting while someone else brings you your food. And that person who is the serving person is lower in status. But Jesus was among them, behaving as a servant among them. And of course, we know that at this during the course of this evening, let's go back to John 13. He demonstrated this with the washing of their feet. So let's just remind ourselves of that in John 13. At the same meal, and again, here's the question I have about the timing of all this. I haven't figured out the exact sequence of when these conversations and events between the Passover and this washing of it, like exactly what order all these things happened in. But it was all at the same evening, at the same sitting that these events took place. So in John 13, beginning in verse 1, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, that he had come from the Father, was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So many things that are in this little setup to this statement, including in verse 3, that he had come from God and was going back to God. Jesus was mindful in this moment of his origin, that he had, as John begins his gospel in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. Jesus is aware of that. At the Last Supper, it is on his mind that he had come from God and that he is shortly going to go back where he came from. So he's nearing the end of his earthly life. He's been here now 30 years, 33 years or so, 32, something. And it's on his mind where he started and where he's shortly to go back to. With that on his mind, we're also told he loved his own to the end. So he's filled with love for these men at the table. So he's thinking about his home, and he's thinking about them and the love that he has for them. And with those two concepts presented, as well as the betrayal of Judas, who he was aware of, it says he rose from supper and took off his outer garment. Remember, they wore two basic things. They had an outer garment and an inner garment. They took off the outer garment, which is what they would say if you were like stripped for work. If you were doing some task, a lot of times you would lay off that garment and then you would just have on like your inner garment. And that would be like when you're getting ready to, do some task. So then he takes a towel, and what he's basically doing is dressing himself as a servant would have been dressed. And he begins to wash their feet. Now, in their world, of course, as you probably know, this is a very common practice when people would enter. If you had servants, if you had a house that had staff, if you were well-to-do and you had the most junior staff, I've read, would be the one who would be assigned to this task. As the guests would arrive, they would give you water and they would wash your feet. If you didn't have staff, if you didn't have anybody, if you weren't that well-to-do and you just kind of a regular person, then you would at the very least provide water. And you might think of some places where it says, let a little water be brought for you to wash your feet. And, there'll be Abraham, I believe, and Lot both said the same thing. So it's the idea that, hey, I'll bring you some water so you can freshen up. Well, as you think about this scene that's happening here, remember Jesus had told them to go into town and you would find a man with a pot of water to show you a room. Everything's been prepared. When they got there was probably no staff. It was just a room and they had the stuff they needed, but there were no servants. And so nobody apparently was there to wash anybody's feet. So they all just reclined at table. If there wasn't a servant there to wash anybody's feet, then I guess they just wouldn't wash their feet this time, which was normally what would be done. So then they're eating, and Jesus gets up, and he takes the role, which any one of them could have done, right? Anybody there could have been the one to be like, hey, let me wash everybody's feet, but that probably never entered their minds because that's something only the lowest of the low servant would do. And here their hearts were thinking about who's going to be at the top of the chain, not who could be at the bottom of the chain. And of course, they all recognized that Jesus was above all of them, but he's showing them that, hey, I'm at the top of the ladder here. And I'm putting myself in this lowest of the low role. And now he's down on his hands and knees with a towel, washing their feet and wiping their feet. It's hard to imagine. This is the Son of God on his knees on the floor, washing grown men's feet. It reminds me, we'll come back here, but let's go to Philippians 2, what Paul says about Jesus there in Philippians 2. Beginning in verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition. That'd be like trying to figure out who's going to be the greatest. Or conceit. But in humility, count others more significant than yourself. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So if you could have, I try to figure out how to illustrate this, but if you've got, let's say that you are the top dog in some way, in whatever realm that is, and then you have the lowest of the low person in the same realm. So this could be in your family, at your work, at school, in the church. If you're at the top and there's somebody at the bottom of the hierarchy, and you move yourself from the top position to make yourself a servant to the lowest person, that's basically what Jesus is doing in this picture. So if you could graph here on the wall the amount that you are humbling yourself. So it's like you're here and this person is below you, and you're going to humble yourself to a lower position than them to serve them, right? Well, imagine if we could somehow have on this same scale, we could draw how high Jesus had started to where he stooped. It would be infinitely high, right? There is no way to fit it on the same scale. If this is where Jesus starts, and this is where he humbles himself to, then the difference between any two of us would be invisible on that scale. Like you wouldn't be able to tell that. It would be like, because he started out as God, which is infinitely high above us. And yet he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. In other words, to grasp, to take hold of, to cling to. These men are trying to they want to get that top spot. They want to be in the chief seat. They want to be at the top. But Jesus started at the top, but he didn't consider that place something to be grasped. He was willing to let go of it. And he was willing to empty himself and humble himself and become a man. Now, in the realm of men, he could have taken any form he wanted. And he would be worthy of having the best of the best of the best of the best of the best as the king and creator of all humanity. It would only be right if he's going to humble himself to take on flesh. He could at least be at but instead of that, he took on the form of a man who lived as a servant. And now we see in this picture the Son of God on his hands and knees, washing these grown men's feet as a picture of humility. And if we think, well, okay, if I'm trying to picture how high you could start and how low you could humble yourself, you couldn't go any higher. Could you go any lower than this task that he is doing at this moment of washing their feet? Like, is there something more menial that he could do to be even more humble? And the answer is yes. And Paul goes on to say that here. Verse 8, Philippians 2, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So when you consider being on your hands and knees washing feet, sounds pretty low in terms of hierarchy or humility. But that's still far, far, far away and better than people spitting on you and the indignity that he had to experience, the shame and the humiliation of being crucified is even, that might be as far down as you can go, because now he took on the form of a condemned criminal and one that everybody was hurling insults at and doing the worst things they could possibly do to him, which of course is way lower than just being a humble servant on the washing feet. So he was willing to go from heaven to the cross. That's the humility that he had, and that's the challenge that Paul says, have this mind in yourselves. That should make us all say, is it I, Lord? I mean, how does this apply to me? I mean, would anybody claim that we've got that figured out? But that's the model that we're given. Now look, as a result of that, he says, therefore, verse 9, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So Jesus shows us that the path to glory is through humility. The path to being exalted is through servitude and sacrifice. Let's go back now to John 13. Jesus spells this out, that he was not just doing this as a demonstration, but it was a teaching opportunity. Verse 12, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You called me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you all should do, just as I have done to you. Truly I say to you, a servant's not greater than his master. If a messenger is greater than, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So these would apply. This message, of course, applies to everybody. It applies to me and you. But think about the way that it applies to the particular men he was talking to. They were going to be given a very important role in the church. These were the apostles. They were going to be given a position of honor in the kingdom, and he's preparing them for how to conduct themselves when they were in that role. Let's now go back to Luke 22. It's interesting, after telling them that you need to become like a servant, he does talk about the special place that these men would occupy. Verse 28 of Luke 22. You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So they were arguing among themselves about who's the greatest, and he says, first of all, you need to become like servants, but secondly, you are going to be given a place of authority. Now, there's kind of two ways you could read that. One is in heaven. Are they going to be in a exalted place in heaven because of their role? That's a possibility. Another possibility, I think, makes to me a little bit more sense in the whole scheme of the story, is that in the kingdom, in very short order after this, it was going to be these 12 who would take his message to the world, who would be seen as leaders of the church, who would call out the Jews for their sins and stand before kings and tell them that you crucified the Son of God. And so they would be given a place of honor in the plan, and they were soon to be occupying that as their role as apostles in the kingdom of Christ. And I suspect that's what he means here about sitting on thrones and all of that, as opposed to in some kind of heavenly sense. But I don't, could that be as well? You can't overstate the importance of their role. In fact, look at Revelation 21. Revelation 21. In John's vision here, notice what is said about the 12. In Revelation 21, we'll start in verse 9. Then came one of the seven angels who had seven bowls of the seven last plagues and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and the gates at the gates 12 angels, and at the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Isn't that something? So here's a picture of the city of God, the New Jerusalem, the bride of the Lamb. And in this picture of the bride of the Lamb, there are 12 foundations, and the names: Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas. The names of the 12 apostles are on these foundations. That shows you they were given a very high honor for their role to be Jesus' spokesman and his apostles that he was going to be sent out. And so he's talking to them here at the Last Supper, and he's trying to correct this attitude problem that they had, where they got this little spat over who is like the most important one, who's going to be the chief guy when in the kingdom, who's going to be at the top and who's going to be next to him. And that's what they're arguing about. And he said, whoa, you've got to become like children. You've got to become like the lowest. You've got to become servants. That's how it's going to be in the kingdom. Yes, they will be given a place of exalted honor, but how are they going to conduct themselves from their throne as an apostle, let's say? What are they going to be like? Are they going to be like those Gentile guys who, when they sit on a throne, they just sort of tell everybody what to do, and they have servants running and jumping and serving their every whim, and they're like benefactors? Or are they going to be like their master, Jesus, who just got down on the floor and washed their feet? And that's what he's challenging them to do. This is how it's done in my kingdom. So that message is, I think, of especial importance for them. But of course, let's now make some applications to ourselves. If you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Peter 5, we will conclude there in just a moment. As we think about how does this apply to me and to you, many people aspire to be leaders. And there's lots of ways to be a leader. You can be a leader in the home. You can be a leader among your friends. You can be a leader on a team that you're on, in your classroom. You can be a leader in the classroom as a student or as a teacher. You can be leaders in the community. A young man, I believe his name is Joseph Faulkner, rang my doorbell yesterday, and he's running for alderman. And as I was talking to him, he said, I think I had you in Leadership Lincoln. So he was in the Youth Leadership Lincoln program in high school. And I was involved in that program at the time, and he remembered that from some years ago. But now he's married and working and running for alderman. I thought, well, good for you. You know, I mean, that we were talking about leadership, and here he is trying to get involved in some role of leadership. And it's a good thing to want to get involved. And there's nothing wrong with aspiring to be a leader. There's no problem with that. We should want to be leaders in whatever way we can. Of course, there's leaders within the church as well. We need people who will be leaders. The Lord wants people to be leaders. But two questions. One, how do I get to be a leader? And number two, what do I do if I find myself in a leadership role? How do I conduct myself? And Jesus tells us the path to this and the way you do it is the exact opposite of what most people think. And so a lot of people claw their way to the top, and they get there by selfish ambition, and they get there by whatever means, hook or crook, they have to do to be at the top spot, because that's what they aspire to do. And then when they get there, they lord it over other people and they enjoy but Jesus is like, not in the kingdom. That's not how it works. If you want to be a leader, you want to be the greatest, make yourself like the youngest. You want to be at the top, make yourself a servant to others. And I think that's true in when you are a leader, then you should be a servant to those around you. We should look to Jesus. If you want to see, like, how could I be an effective leader? You could do no better than to look at the example of the Son of God. And Jesus was among those over whom he was their leader, but he was among them as a servant. And he was one who knelt down to serve them. That's what leadership looks like in the church. And as a Christian, that's what we should aspire to do. And if you don't have to wait until somebody says, hey, you're the leader now, to start serving. In fact, we can all start serving at wherever we are. And that is, oddly enough, a path to leadership. Jesus' way is through humility and through service. In fact, here in Peter, it says, 1 Peter 5, verse 6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. So if you aspire to glory, if you aspire to have honor and recognition, Peter says, here's how you do it. You go the other way. You humble yourself and humble yourself. And at the right time, God will exalt you. We see that in Jesus' example. He humbled himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him a name above every name. And Paul says, have the same mind in you. That's the goal. That's how we should do it. So if we want glory, if you want honor, if you want that position, then it begins by being humble and it begins by serving others. And I think we could all just take this as a challenge this week. Look for some opportunity to be of service. I don't know about you, I need regular reminding of that. I need that some people just are kind of servants by nature. I think that's just in their makeup, their personality. But if it may or may not be just come naturally to you, it may be something you have to be intentional about and make a point to think about. What can I do for somebody else? Do not look to your own interest, Paul says, but to the interest of others. That means, like, look around, look outside of yourself. And there should never be a task where you would say, oh, I wouldn't do that. Like, that's below me. Because look at what Jesus did. It wasn't below him. So there shouldn't be some opportunity that comes along and you're like, yeah, I would help somebody. I'm not going to do that. That's beneath my position. We shouldn't think that way. We should make ourselves the lowest and make ourselves servants to others. So look for an opportunity to serve somebody else. Do something for somebody beside yourself. And if you happen to be in a leadership role in some realm of whatever that may be, use that opportunity to be of service, not to make things easier and better for yourself. And finally, I wanted to end on this note, verse 8. He says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. It's interesting that at the Last Supper, you have Jesus, the Son of God, sitting there having a meal with his followers, and several times Satan is mentioned. He entered into Judas. Like, there's Jesus, there's these men in this room, and the devil's in there too, at work. And I think you see, although his name is not mentioned, but I think you see him at work as well when this conversation turns from, is it I, to some argument over who's the greatest. Because that's exactly the kind of thing Satan would want us to be arguing about. That's the kind of thing that is the temptation of the devil that we have to look out for. The pride of life, that kind of arrogance, that kind of conceited, proud thing, all goes back to Satan, goes back to the garden. So even when you least expect it, he's prowling around as a roaring lion. So we need to be on guard against those temptations because we should expect them at any time. If there's someone here this morning who needs to do something to make your life right with God, please let us know as we stand and sing.